Welcome to this whole study we're going to start this week on the life of Jacob. It's really a journey of Jacob turning into Israel. And if you don't know the history of Jacob, you need to kind of get your head around that. Jacob has so many different components in the Bible. He was the father of Joseph. He was the leader, the father really of Israel as a country. His sons were the tribes of Israel. So there's all kinds of things that you get about Jacob that you don't get about anybody else in the Bible. And when you study the lives of people in the Bible, one thing that always jumps out to you is failure. You know, David failed, Abraham failed, Moses failed, Paul failed, but all of those guys ended up succeeding. Even Joseph that I just spoke of, he failed and then he succeeded. And the truth is, friends, we all fail, don't we? We all just like, wow, we crash and we burn. And that helps us to be able to relate to these guys. The thing about Jacob that's really interesting is that his life is marked by failure over and over and over. Even when he wrestles with God, gets some healing, he tends to fall back to where he came from. And the truth is, for many of us, we experience that as well. He is considered one of the three patriarchs. So if you're talking about the patriarchs of Israel, it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And remember this, Isaac was Jacob's father. And a lot of us don't get that all straight, but he was. Abraham was Jacob's grandfather. So often we forget that, we forget that Jacob was the father of the Jewish race, and that's why his name became Israel and all of that kind of stuff. So we're going to walk into that journey the next few weeks. Very interesting story. Deep journey, starts in Genesis 25, runs up into 30 to 35, of Genesis chapter 30 to 35. And he's really a picture of a battle that goes on inside of people. He's a picture of the flesh and the spirit wrestling with each other. So let's start in Genesis 25, 21. If you're in your small group, we're glad you're there. We want you to drill down on some of this stuff and really weigh it out because it's deep stuff. It says in Genesis 25 that Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. Now let's stop there just for a minute. Remember this. Abraham's wife was barren, Isaac's wife was barren, and Jacob's wife was also barren. And it says that the Lord answered Isaac, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived, but the children struggled within her. And she said, if it is so, why then am I this way? And she went in to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 whole people groups. 2 peoples will be separated from your body. One people will be stronger than the others, and the older shall serve the younger. So let's stop right there. These 2 brothers that were going to be born from Rebekah were going to have a huge life battle. Now, the great news is God gets in the middle of it, but it's a hard, tough battle. The truth is, friends, there's a picture here of the sovereignty of God that's gigantic. It's just gigantic. Because we know this, the younger would rule over the older. So God had planned that from the beginning. Now that all takes place and takes shape through a bunch of deception. That was not God's plan. God's plan wasn't the deception. His plan was that the younger would be over the older. It says in Acts 17:26, then he made one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined, listen to these words, their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him. So these are hard things for us to get our heads around, but God has established parameters that we all live in. This is his sovereignty, friends. This is what God does. He sets times and destinies, and yet within those boundaries, he gives us a free will. Think like this. The book of Revelation is going to happen no matter what you do or I do. So that's the sovereignty of God. There's going to be an end time. There's going to be a demonic response to that end time. There's nothing you and I can do. You couldn't go out and take into your own hands something to try to save people from the end of time. You couldn't do that. You couldn't kill the demonic response. There's just nothing we can do, friends. That's impossible for us because God has set these things. So the truth is the sovereignty of God and the free will of man has been debated for centuries. So I certainly don't expect you to answer that question in your small group, but it is worth discussing and understanding the parameters that God puts around humanity and then says, now work within these things, you have free will. See, God set Jacob over Esau, friends, before they were even born. That was going to happen. Paul walked right through that in Romans chapter 9, verses 6 to 14. He never flinches with it. You ought to read those verses and talk about them, because Paul wasn't upset that God was sovereign, and you shouldn't be either. You ought to actually find safety in that. See, part of that then settles into this thing. Jacob stealing his brother's birthright. Now let me explain that to you. The birthright's given to the eldest son, and Esau was an interesting guy as well as Jacob. Esau was spontaneous, generous, but he was pretty much a slave to his own senses. He was a very sensual guy. He loved a quick rush. He wanted his outcome right now. He wanted whatever's going to happen. He would have fit in our culture really well. He disregarded his inheritance and his birthright as a senior son because of that. Now, Jacob, he was much more plain, much of a deeper thinker, wasn't really interested in the stuff of the world, but he had an immense capacity for faith, but he also had a huge problem with duplicity and lying, which makes him a really interesting biblical character. See, he understood the value of the birthright while Esau never did. Esau really didn't care about his birthright. That's why he was so willing to give it up. The birthright wasn't, listen friends, it wasn't just earthly riches. That's what we always think. Well, the eldest son gets all the inheritance. No. Because see, Esau didn't get all that inheritance, but he was still wealthy after he lost the birthright. This was more about spiritual heritage, which Jacob was way more interested in than Esau. It carried the rights of the Father and a picture of us when we're adopted into God's family. And that's what Jacob was interested in, being adopted into a spiritual family. God offers us so much, friends, when he adopts us. Hope, healing, strength, wholeness. He says, listen, I want to adopt you in. And Jacob got that. He was blessed. But the question really was for Jacob, what do you do with your blessing? Esau did nothing with it when he had it. Jacob wanted to do everything with it, and that's why God gave it to him. So what I'd like you to do in your small group, I'd like you to just stop today, talk about the sovereignty of God. Read Romans 9. Talk about the riches that God offers us when he adopts us. Because see, friends, that birthright in the Old Testament is just a shadow and a picture of your birthright in the New Testament. That as children of God, he gives you his glory and possibility at gigantic riches and length. So I want you to have a talk about that today, and then we'll be back next week and talk about really how do you live out of those riches? How do you walk out of your adoption? How do you live in your birthright? And we'll be into that next week. God bless you. Hope you have a great discussion.